Los Angeles was a city of contradictions, where bright lights cast long shadows. Beneath the skyscrapers that touched the heavens, people like Claire Simmons worked tirelessly in the gritty underbelly of it all. At 24, Claire's life revolved around double shifts at Ruby's Diner, a greasy spoon tucked away in a corner of the city that the wealthy drove past without a second glance. Her hands worked mechanically, sliding plates of eggs and bacon across the counter while her mind drifted. She thought of her grandmother, Eleanor, whose frail body had been confined to a worn recliner since a stroke 2 years ago, and of her 10-year-old brother, Tommy, whose laughter had grown quieter since his diagnosis. The scar running along her right cheek was a physical reminder of another battle she didn't talk about. It was long and faint now, but the memory of the car accident that took her parents' lives, and nearly her own, still burned fresh in her mind. Customers rarely asked about it, but their eyes lingered long enough for her to feel exposed. She was in the middle of pouring coffee when the bell above the diner door jingled. Claire didn't look up right away. Ruby's was no stranger to all types. Blue-collar workers grabbing a bite, tourists lost on their way to someplace better. But when the air seemed to shift, she glanced toward the door. He stood out immediately. Dorian Westwood, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, looked as though he'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. His slicked-back hair and piercing gray eyes gave him an aura of control, a stark contrast to the tired faces around him. The whispers began before he even made it to a booth. Claire couldn't resist rolling her eyes. Rich types like him didn't belong in places like Ruby's. What could someone like him want here? As she approached his table, notepad in hand, she realized he wasn't even looking at the menu. His sharp gaze was fixed on her. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her tone clipped but polite. "You," he said simply, his voice low and measured. Claire blinked, stunned by the brazenness of his words. "Excuse me?" Dorian's lips curved into a faint smirk. "Not in the way you're thinking," he clarified, leaning back in the booth with an air of practiced ease. "I have a proposition for you." She crossed her arms, the notepad forgotten. "Look, if this is some kind of joke—" "It's not," he interrupted, his tone hardening. He pulled a sleek envelope from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. "Read this when you have time, but I'll save you the trouble. I'm offering you a contract. A marriage contract." The words hung in the air, absurd and impossible. Claire couldn't stop the incredulous laugh that escaped her. "A marriage contract? With me? Do you even know who I am?" "I know enough," he replied coolly. "You're Claire Simmons. You work 2 jobs to support your grandmother and brother. You're smart, resourceful, and resilient. You don't waste time feeling sorry for yourself, and frankly, you don't care what people think of you. That's exactly what I need." Her stomach churned as his words struck a nerve. "I'm not for sale," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Dorian's expression didn't waver. "You're thinking about this the wrong way. This isn't about ownership. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. I need a wife to secure a business deal, someone who's independent and won't cling to me when it's over. You need money for your family. The contract ensures you get what you need. No strings attached." Claire stared at him, the scar on her cheek burning as she processed his audacity. "You think you can just walk in here, wave some cash around, and solve my problems?" Dorian shrugged, unfazed. "I think you're smarter than most people in this room. Smart enough to see an opportunity when it's presented." Her instinct screamed at her to throw the envelope back at him, but something stopped her. Was it desperation? The unpaid bills piling up on the kitchen table? Tommy's worsening condition? She shook her head, her voice cracking as she said, "I'd rather live poor and free than be your puppet." "Think about it," he said, rising from the booth. He dropped $100 bill on the table, far more than the cost of his untouched coffee, and strode out without a backward glance. Claire remained frozen, the envelope heavy in her hands. She didn't want to open it, but curiosity, and maybe a sliver of hope, nagged at her. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of her situation pressed down harder. By the time her shift ended, Tommy's doctor had called. His condition was worsening, and they needed money for more tests. Money Claire didn't have. That night, as she sat at the kitchen table staring at the envelope, she finally tore it open. The terms were clear, the sum of money astronomical, enough to pay Tommy's bills and secure a better life for her family. Claire's hands trembled as she considered what signing this would mean. Her freedom? Her dignity? But her family's needs were bigger than her pride. With a deep breath, she made her decision. Claire stared at the bold black ink of her signature on the crisp white contract. It felt wrong, as though she had just signed away a part of herself. Yet, she reminded herself why she was doing this. Tommy needed her to be strong. Her fingers lingered over the pen, as if erasing her name were still an option, but the deal was done. The next day, a sleek black car arrived at her tiny apartment complex. Claire had barely packed when Dorian's driver knocked on her door, brisk and impersonal. It wasn't until they pulled up to the gates of Dorian's Beverly Hills mansion that the magnitude of her decision hit her. The house was enormous, its ivory facade gleaming under the California sun. It looked like a palace, but as Claire stepped inside, the sterile chill of the interior made it feel more like a museum than a home. Expensive art adorned the walls, and spotless glass surfaces reflected her hesitant figure as she walked. There was no sign of warmth, no photographs, no personal touches, only cold perfection. Dorian stood waiting in the grand foyer, his posture as composed as ever. He gestured briefly to a man standing off to the side. "Victor Langston, my assistant. He'll help you get settled." Victor was tall and impeccably dressed, his polished demeanor matching Dorian's. But unlike his employer, Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome, Miss Simmons," he said smoothly, his voice carrying a faint hint of amusement. "Or should I say, Mrs. Westwood?" Claire tensed at the way he emphasized the title, his tone making it sound more like a taunt than a courtesy. "Claire is fine," she replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Victor's eyes flicked over her as though sizing her up. "Of course, Claire," he said, the corners of his mouth curling into a smirk. "I'm here to ensure everything runs smoothly for Mr. Westwood. And for you, of course." Claire didn't miss the faint edge in his tone. There was something about Victor that unsettled her, though she couldn't quite place it. Dorian, uninterested in pleasantries, interrupted. "Victor will show you to your room. Dinner is at 7. Be punctual." With that, he turned and disappeared down one of the many halls, leaving Claire alone with Victor. "This way," Victor said, leading her through the labyrinthine halls. "You'll find this place takes some getting used to." As she followed him, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's words carried a double meaning. She was certain of one thing: getting used to this house and the life she'd signed up for would be far from easy. Claire sat at the end of the long, gleaming dining table that evening, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her water glass. The room was eerily quiet, save for the faint clink of silverware as Dorian methodically worked through his meal. The sheer size of the space made her feel even smaller, and the emptiness of the mansion echoed in the silence between them. She cleared her throat, determined to break the awkward tension. "Do you always eat dinner like this? Quiet enough to hear your thoughts echo?" Dorian didn't look up. "Silence is efficient," he replied, cutting into his steak with precision. Claire raised an eyebrow. "Efficient for what? Brooding?" The faintest twitch of his lips betrayed a suppressed smile, though he didn't answer. Claire bit back a grin, feeling a small sense of victory. For all his poise and control, she'd managed to chip at his armor, if only slightly. "Look," she continued, setting her fork down, "I know this isn't exactly a fairy tale for either of us, but if we're stuck with this arrangement, maybe we can try to make it a little less painful. I mean, do you even know how to relax?" Dorian finally met her gaze, his gray eyes cool but curious. "Relaxation isn't a priority for me." Claire leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Of course it's not. You're too busy being, what? A ruthless businessman? A robot in a suit?" His lips twitched again, this time closer to a smile. "And what are you? A comedian?" "Not professionally," she quipped, unable to resist the jab. Before Dorian could reply, Victor entered the room, his presence as sharp as his tailored suit. He glanced at Claire with barely concealed disdain, then turned to Dorian. "The contract for the Westwood International merger has been finalized. I'll have it on your desk by morning." Dorian nodded, his attention already shifting to business. Claire noticed the change in him immediately, the stiffening of his shoulders, the clipped tone. Victor lingered, his gaze flickering briefly to Claire. "Will you be needing anything else, Mr. Westwood?" he asked, his tone overly formal. "No," Dorian replied without looking up. As Victor turned to leave, Claire caught the faintest smirk on his face. It was the kind of smirk that said, "You don't belong here." Once they were alone again, Claire frowned. "Does he always look at people like they're beneath him? Or is that just reserved for me?" Dorian sighed, setting his fork down. "Victor's loyalty is to me. You're new to him. Give it time." Claire wasn't convinced. She could feel Victor's disdain radiating from every interaction, and something told her there was more to his hostility than mere loyalty. The dazzling chandeliers of the crystal hall bathed the room in golden light, their brilliance mirrored by the sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Claire felt suffocated, the din of polite chatter and clinking glasses a deafening reminder that she didn't belong here. Dorian had said little as they arrived, his instructions concise and cold. "Smile. Keep your answers brief. Avoid confrontation." His words still echoed in her mind as she stood by his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Eyes followed them as they moved through the crowd. Whispers flitted from one group to the next, low but sharp. "Who is she? Did you see her face? Another one of his little projects?" Claire's scar felt like it was burning under the weight of their stares. She tried to cover it with makeup, but under the harsh lights, the faint line was still visible, a reminder of a life far removed from the elegance surrounding her. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, determined not to let them see her discomfort. When Dorian paused to speak with an associate, she forced a polite smile, her fingers gripping the stem of her champagne glass like a lifeline. But her composure faltered when she caught Dorian's gaze. He wasn't looking at the crowd or their surroundings. He was staring at her. It wasn't the sharp, assessing look she was used to. His expression was softer, almost uncertain, as if he was seeing her for the first time. And then, almost imperceptibly, his eyes flicked to the scar. Her stomach twisted. She knew that look too well: curiosity, pity, even discomfort. It was the look of someone seeing her as less than whole. Anger flared, masking the vulnerability, threatening to spill over. "If you're going to stare, Mr. Westwood," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, "at least have the decency to be subtle about it." Dorian blinked, his expression shifting to something unreadable. "I wasn't." He stopped himself, his lips pressing into a thin line. "That wasn't my intention." "Of course it wasn't," she replied sharply, her smile returning, brittle and defiant. He didn't answer, but the tension between them was palpable. As the evening dragged on, Claire kept her guard up, determined not to let Dorian, or anyone else, see how deeply their stares cut. But as she stole a glance at Dorian across the room, she saw the conflict in his eyes. And for the first time, she wondered if he wasn't as unshakable as he seemed. The mansion was quiet that afternoon, the kind of silence that pressed against Claire's ears and amplified her every step on the polished floors. She had been restless since the gala, the weight of the stairs and Dorian's reaction to her scar still fresh in her mind. Eager to escape the suffocating stillness, she wandered aimlessly through the halls. The rooms were immaculately designed but sterile, devoid of personal touches. Dorian's life, it seemed, was as carefully curated as the artwork that adorned his walls. She paused by a slightly ajar door and peeked inside. It was an office, modern and pristine, with shelves lined with books and a sleek desk commanding the center. Curiosity tugged at her. She stepped inside, her eyes drawn to the papers scattered across the desk. At first, it was all business jargon she didn't understand: contracts, reports, and spreadsheets. But then her eyes landed on a familiar name in bold print. Her heart skipped. It was the name of the redevelopment project that had targeted her old neighborhood. Claire's pulse quickened as she skimmed the document. Words like acquisition, relocation, and demolition leapt off the page. The date on the paper matched the year her family had lost everything. Her chest tightened. Could this be a coincidence? Or had Dorian's empire been built, at least in part, on the ashes of her past? The sound of footsteps in the hall snapped her out of her thoughts. Quickly, she tucked the document back where she found it and slipped out of the room. Later that evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, the tension in Claire's chest became unbearable. She set her fork down and met Dorian's gaze. "I found something today," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Dorian raised an eyebrow. "And?" Her eyes didn't waver. "A document in your office. It mentions a redevelopment project in my old neighborhood. The same neighborhood that was destroyed by a fire." Dorian froze, the normally confident lines of his face hardening. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," she shot back. "Not yet, but I need to know. Were you involved?" His response was clipped, almost offensive. "I don't personally oversee every project. What happened there was before my time." Claire studied him, searching for cracks in his composure. He looked uneasy, as though her words had struck a nerve. "You didn't deny it outright," she said quietly. "I don't have anything to deny," he replied, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. Claire leaned back, her suspicions deepening. There was more to uncover. She was sure of it. Claire stood at the edge of the sprawling garden, her arms wrapped around herself as the cool evening air pressed against her skin. The mansion's grounds were a world away from the chaos she'd left behind, a pristine and silent expanse of perfection. Yet, even surrounded by such beauty, she felt out of place, like a trespasser in someone else's dream. The past week had been grueling. The whispers from Dorian's social circle still rang in her ears, each sharp word cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She'd overheard one woman sneer, "She's just a charity case." His latest project, the scar on her cheek, seemed to draw their attention, their gazes lingering just a second too long. Dorian hadn't offered much support, either. He had been distant, speaking only when necessary, his words as measured as ever. She knew he wasn't one for emotional displays, but his silence in the face of their scrutiny had stung. As she brushed her hand over a cluster of roses, their petals soft against her fingers, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Dorian, his sharp suit replaced by a casual sweater and slacks, an unusual look for the ever-composed billionaire. "I didn't think you'd be out here," he said, his voice softer than usual. Claire shrugged, her eyes returning to the garden. "Needed some air. Too quiet inside." He stepped closer, his gaze following hers. "It's quiet everywhere in this house." His words surprised her, and she glanced at him, noting the weariness in his expression. For the first time, he didn't seem as impenetrable. "Is that why you live like this?" she asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. "In this big, empty house, surrounded by people who don't really know you?" Dorian's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't deflect. "Maybe. I've always found it easier to keep people at a distance. It's safer that way." Claire hesitated before asking, "Safer from what?" He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the roses. "From disappointment. From caring about someone only to have them leave." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. She had never imagined Dorian Westwood. Stoic, confident Dorian carried wounds of his own. She softened, leaning slightly closer. "That's a lonely way to live." He glanced at her, his gray eyes unusually open. "Maybe, but it's predictable." Claire shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You think you're so complicated, don't you?" Newsflash. Everyone's been hurt. It doesn't mean you shut the world out. Dorian smirked faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting. "And what would you suggest? Let them all in and hope for the best?" "Not everyone," she said, meeting his gaze. "Just the ones who matter." For a moment, they stood in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them. The tension that usually hung between them seemed to soften, replaced by something gentler. "You're different," Dorian finally said, almost to himself. Claire raised an eyebrow. "Because I don't care about your money?" "Because you see things differently," he replied, his voice quieter. "You're not afraid to say what you're thinking. It's refreshing." Claire didn't respond immediately, letting his words hang between them. She wasn't sure what to make of this side of him, but for the first time, she felt like she was beginning to understand the man behind the armor. As they stood together in the garden, the barriers between them didn't disappear completely, but they softened, fragile, like the petals of the roses around them. Claire sat in her room, staring at the open notebook on her lap. The notes she'd taken from her conversation with James Harper stared back at her like an accusation. Names, dates, and vague details were scattered across the page, fragments of a puzzle she was still struggling to piece together. Her thoughts wavered between fear and determination. Confronting Dorian seemed like the logical step. If he was innocent, he deserved to know what was being hidden in his name. But what if he wasn't? What if everything she feared about him was true? She leaned back, closing her eyes as guilt clawed at her. Every step she took closer to the truth felt like a betrayal of the fragile bond she and Dorian were beginning to form. But then she thought of her family, of the fire, of her parents' absence, of the years she and Tommy had scraped by. The knock on her door snapped her out of her thoughts. Dorian's voice followed, calm but firm. "Claire, may I come in?" She hesitated before responding. "Sure." He entered, his presence commanding as always, but there was a softness in his expression that caught her off guard. His gaze swept over the notebook on her lap, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he folded his arms and leaned against the doorframe. "You've been distant," he said simply. Claire tensed. "I've just had a lot on my mind." Dorian's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone sharpening. "Don't insult my intelligence. Something's changed, and I think I deserve to know what it is." Her stomach churned, and for a moment, she considered brushing him off. But his steady gaze held her, silently demanding honesty. "You're right," she admitted, setting the notebook aside. "I've been looking into the redevelopment project, the one tied to my neighborhood." Dorian straightened, the hint of surprise on his face quickly masked by a more familiar coolness. "And I spoke to someone who used to work for your company," she continued, her voice gaining strength despite the tension thickening between them. "He said there were irregularities, decisions made that might have contributed to what happened to my family." Dorian's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "And you think I was involved?" "I don't know," Claire said honestly, "but I need to find out. For my family." The silence that followed was heavy, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. "You think I'm capable of that kind of destruction?" Dorian asked, his voice low but laced with something raw. "I don't want to," she replied, meeting his gaze. "But I can't ignore what I've found. Not when it might be the answer I've been searching for." Dorian took a step closer, his expression conflicted. "You think I would stand by while people were hurt? While you were hurt?" Claire swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to think anymore. You've built walls around yourself, and I don't know what's real and what's just another mask." For the first time, Dorian seemed at a loss for words. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he exhaled deeply. "You don't trust me." "It's not just about trust," she said softly. "It's about finding the truth." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Then find it. But I hope when you do, you'll realize I'm not the villain you think I am." As he left the room, Claire felt the weight of his words settle over her. The choice before her wasn't just about her family. It was about whether she could reconcile the man Dorian seemed to be with the truth she was uncovering. Claire sat in the dimly lit library of Dorian's mansion, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through old project files on her laptop. The files had taken hours to track down. Buried in obscure company archives, she had accessed through a login she'd found scribbled in an old folder. Each file painted a clearer picture of a scheme that was far worse than she'd imagined. Victor's name appeared repeatedly, his signature authorizing rushed inspections, his emails pushing for expedited clearances without safety protocols, and his personal recommendations for companies notorious for cutting corners. One email, dated just weeks before the fire, chilled her to the core. "Ensure the site is cleared by the deadline. No delays will be tolerated." There was no explicit mention of the fire, but the intent was unmistakable. Victor had been instrumental in the redevelopment project, and his decisions had put lives at risk. Claire's breath hitched as she leaned back in the chair, her mind racing. This was the evidence she needed. a direct link between Victor's actions and the devastation of her neighborhood. She quickly saved the files to a flash drive, her heart pounding as she slipped it into her pocket. She needed to show Dorian. Whatever his involvement, or lack thereof, she couldn't let this go unanswered. But before she could close the laptop, the sound of a door creaking open made her freeze. "Working late, are we?" Victor's voice was smooth, almost casual, but it carried an undercurrent of menace that sent a chill down her spine. Claire forced herself to remain calm as she turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. "I couldn't sleep," she said, gesturing to the bookshelves. "Thought I'd get some reading done." Victor stepped further into the room, his sharp eyes scanning the desk. His gaze lingered a moment too long on the laptop before returning to her. "Interesting choice of reading material," Claire shrugged, doing her best to seem unbothered. "I was curious about the company's history. Figured I should know more about what I've married into." Victor's smirk didn't reach his eyes. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Claire, especially when you start poking around in things that don't concern you." Her pulse quickened, but she held his gaze. "Why would the company's history concern me? Unless there's something I shouldn't know about." Victor took a step closer, his tone dropping to a near whisper. "Let me give you a piece of advice. This life, Dorian's life, isn't for everyone. It's easy to get lost in things you don't understand, and sometimes people make mistakes when they try to play hero." His words were a thinly veiled threat, and Claire felt her chest tighten. She forced a small, defiant smile. "Thanks for the advice, Victor. I'll keep that in mind." He studied her for a moment longer, as if assessing how much she already knew, then turned and walked out of the room. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him felt like a release valve on the tension that had been building in her chest. Claire immediately retrieved the flash drive from her pocket, clutching it tightly as she considered her next move. Victor had clearly suspected something, and now she was certain he wouldn't hesitate to act if he thought she was a threat. Her mind raced as she crept back to her room, locking the door behind her. She hid the flash drive in the lining of her purse, ensuring it would be safe if Victor decided to search her belongings. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Claire tried to steady her breathing. She had uncovered the truth, or at least part of it, but the danger she now faced was undeniable. Victor wasn't just ruthless. He was calculated and dangerous. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through her window, Claire knew one thing for certain. She couldn't back down. The truth was too important, and no threat from Victor would stop her from exposing it. But she would have to tread carefully. Her life might depend on it. Claire paced the length of her room, the flash drive clutched tightly in her hand. The evidence she had found against Victor was damning, but there was one person who needed to see it before she could take the next step. Dorian. She had hesitated long enough. If she didn't confront him now, she risked Victor finding a way to cover his tracks, or worse, silencing her entirely. Steeling herself, Claire headed to Dorian's office, where she knew he spent most mornings. The door was slightly ajar, and she knocked before stepping inside. Dorian sat at his desk, his focus on the papers in front of him. When he looked up, his expression shifted from surprise to mild concern. "Claire?" he asked, setting his pen down. "What's going on?" Her throat tightened as she approached his desk, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her. "We need to talk." He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. She placed the flash drive on his desk and met his gaze. "I found something about the redevelopment project, the one that destroyed my neighborhood." Dorian's brows furrowed as he picked up the drive. "What is this?" "Evidence," Claire said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "It ties Victor to decisions that caused the fire. But it also shows your name on the approvals." His face hardened. "I've told you before, I don't oversee every project personally. I delegate." Claire's voice rose, her frustration spilling over. "That's not an excuse, Dorian. Your name is on this. Whether you knew it or not, you're responsible for what happened to my family, to my entire neighborhood." Dorian's expression faltered, his composure cracking. He inserted the flash drive into his laptop, his eyes scanning the documents she had uncovered. With each passing moment, his jaw tightened, and his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the desk. When he finally looked up, his gray eyes were clouded with guilt. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I swear to you, Claire, I didn't know." "But you should have," she shot back, her voice breaking. "You trusted people like Victor to do the right thing, and they didn't. And now my family is paying the price for your negligence." Dorian stood, his shoulders heavy with the weight of her words. "You're right," he admitted. "I should have known. I should have been better." He took a step closer, his voice trembling with resolve. "But I can fix this. I don't care what it takes. I'll make it right." Claire wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her. "Why should I trust you? How do I know this isn't just another empty promise?" Dorian hesitated, then sighed deeply. "You don't. But I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove I'm not the man Victor made me out to be." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard, and she nodded reluctantly. "One chance. That's all you get." Later that day, Claire found herself in the living room, tending to her grandmother, who had been struggling with another bout of weakness. As she adjusted the blanket over Eleanor's frail frame, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Dorian standing in the doorway, holding a tray with a bowl of soup and a glass of water. "I thought I could help," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Claire blinked in surprise, unsure of how to respond. She stepped aside as Dorian set the tray down and knelt by Eleanor's side. "Mrs. Simmons," he said gently, "I'm Dorian. I know we haven't had much of a chance to talk, but I'd like to change that." Eleanor gave him a weak but warm smile. "You're the one keeping my granddaughter so busy." Dorian chuckled softly, meeting Claire's gaze briefly before turning back to Eleanor. "I'd like to think she's keeping me busy." Claire watched as he carefully helped her grandmother sit up, holding the glass of water steady as she sipped. There was a tenderness in his actions she hadn't expected, a glimpse of the man he could be beneath the cold, businesslike exterior. As the evening wore on, Claire found herself reevaluating everything she thought she knew about Dorian. For the first time, she saw a man who wasn't just trying to make amends. He was trying to understand her world, her struggles. And while she wasn't ready to forgive him yet, she felt the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart. Claire had barely slept. The tension from her confrontation with Dorian still clung to her like a heavy cloak, but there was no time to process it. The next morning, as she descended the grand staircase, the muffled sound of voices drifted from the foyer. When she reached the bottom, Victor was standing by the front door, his posture rigid and his tone sharp. Dorian stood opposite him, his expression cold but controlled. Their conversation halted the moment they noticed her. "Good morning," she said cautiously, glancing between the two men. Victor's smile was tight and unconvincing. "Morning, Claire. It seems you've been busy." Her stomach twisted at his words, but she kept her expression neutral. "Busy with what?" Victor stepped closer, holding up a tablet. The screen displayed an article from a business news site, its headline glaring. "Westwood Industries faces backlash. Whistleblower exposes shady redevelopment practices." Claire's heart plummeted. She scanned the article, and her name jumped out like a glaring beacon. Claire Simmons, a new member of the Westwood household, is said to have leaked sensitive company information related to past redevelopment projects. "What?" she whispered, her throat tightening. She looked up at Victor, her voice trembling. "I didn't. This isn't true." Victor's smirk was predatory. "It's funny how the timing aligns perfectly with your sudden interest in company files. You were seen spending a great deal of time in the office recently. Surely you can see how it looks." Dorian's gaze shifted to Claire, his expression unreadable. "Did you?" Her chest ached at the question. "You think I'd do this?" She shot back, her voice rising. "After everything we talked about, after everything I've told you?" Victor interjected smoothly. "It's not a matter of what she says, Dorian. It's about what the evidence shows. The files in question were accessed from your office computer, and Claire was the last person seen there." Claire's hands curled into fists. "You're framing me," she said, her voice filled with quiet fury. "You're the one trying to cover your tracks." Victor chuckled, his calm demeanor infuriating. "Accusations without proof, Claire? You'll need to do better than that." Dorian raised a hand, silencing them both. "Enough," he said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. He turned to Claire, his expression conflicted. I need to figure out what's going on. Until I do, I think it's best if you stay out of the office. Claire's heart shattered at his words, but she swallowed her hurt. You're letting him win, she said quietly. Dorian hesitated, but his gaze hardened. I'm trying to protect this company, and until I have clarity, I can't take sides. The betrayal stung more than she expected. Without another word, Claire turned and walked out of the room, her vision blurred by tears. Back in her room, Claire paced furiously. Victor's smug face was etched in her mind, his calculated threat a warning that he wasn't finished with her yet. She wanted to leave, to pack her things and walk out of the mansion, but something inside her refused to let him win. Her family had lost too much because of this man. If she left now, she would never uncover the full truth about what he had done. As the afternoon wore on, Claire's resolve hardened. She would stay, not for Dorian, who had failed to stand by her, but for herself and her family. Victor wanted her gone because she was getting too close. That meant there was more to uncover, and she would find it. Late that evening, Claire waited until the house was quiet. Armed with a small flashlight, she slipped into the office once more, her heart pounding with every creak of the floorboards. She began searching through the physical files Victor had left behind, her fingers trembling as she flipped through folder after folder. Most of it was routine company documentation, but then she found a small envelope marked private. Inside were copies of emails and memos, communications that directly implicated Victor in the rushed redevelopment and hinted at payoffs to local officials. Her breath caught as she read one email. Ensure the Simmons property is cleared by any means necessary. I don't care about delays or complaints. Tears blurred her vision, but she quickly stuffed the papers back into the envelope. This was it, proof that Victor was behind the devastation her family had endured. As she turned to leave, a shadow loomed in the doorway. Well, Victor's voice drawled, laced with menace. Caught red-handed, Claire froze, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. She met his gaze, her fear giving way to defiance. You can't stop me, she said, her voice steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. Not this time. Victor's smirk widened. We'll see about that. Claire had barely slept. The tension from her confrontation with Dorian still clung to her like a heavy cloak, but there was no time to process it. The next morning, as she descended the grand staircase, the muffled sound of voices drifted from the foyer. When she reached the bottom, Victor was standing by the front door, his posture rigid and his tone sharp. Dorian stood opposite him, his expression cold but controlled. Their conversation halted the moment they noticed her. Good morning, she said cautiously, glancing between the two men. Victor's smile was tight and unconvincing. Morning, Claire. It seems you've been busy. Her stomach twisted at his words, but she kept her expression neutral. Busy with what? Victor stepped closer, holding up a tablet. The screen displayed an article from a business news site, its headline glaring. Westwood Industries faces backlash. Whistleblower exposes shady redevelopment practices. Claire's heart plummeted. She scanned the article, and her name jumped out like a glaring beacon. Claire Simmons, a new member of the Westwood household, is said to have leaked sensitive company information related to past redevelopment projects. What? She whispered, her throat tightening. She looked up at Victor, her voice trembling. I didn't. This isn't true. Victor's smirk was predatory. It's funny how the timing aligns perfectly with your sudden interest in company files. You were seen spending a great deal of time in the office recently. Surely you can see how it looks. Dorian's gaze shifted to Claire, his expression unreadable. Did you? Her chest ached at the question. You think I'd do this? She shot back, her voice rising. After everything we talked about, after everything I've told you? Victor interjected smoothly. It's not a matter of what she says, Dorian. It's about what the evidence shows. The files in question were accessed from your office computer, and Claire was the last person seen there. Claire's hands curled into fists. You're framing me, she said, her voice filled with quiet fury. You're the one trying to cover your tracks. Victor chuckled, his calm demeanor infuriating. Accusations without proof. Claire? You'll need to do better than that. Dorian raised a hand, silencing them both. Enough, he said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. He turned to Claire, his expression conflicted. I need to figure out what's going on. Until I do, I think it's best if you stay out of the office. Claire's heart shattered at his words, but she swallowed her hurt. You're letting him win, she said quietly. Dorian hesitated, but his gaze hardened. I'm trying to protect this company, and until I have clarity, I can't take sides. The betrayal stung more than she expected. Without another word, Claire turned and walked out of the room, her vision blurred by tears. Back in her room, Claire paced furiously. Victor's smug face was etched in her mind, his calculated threat a warning that he wasn't finished with her yet. She wanted to leave, to pack her things and walk out of the mansion, but something inside her refused to let him win. Her family had lost too much because of this man. If she left now, she would never uncover the full truth about what he had done. As the afternoon wore on, Claire's resolve hardened. She would stay, not for Dorian, who had failed to stand by her, but for herself and her family. Victor wanted her gone because she was getting too close. That meant there was more to uncover, and she would find it. Late that evening, Claire waited until the house was quiet. Armed with a small flashlight, she slipped into the office once more, her heart pounding with every creak of the floorboards. She began searching through the physical files Victor had left behind, her fingers trembling as she flipped through folder after folder. Most of it was routine company documentation, but then she found a small envelope marked private. Inside were copies of emails and memos, communications that directly implicated Victor in the rushed redevelopment and hinted at payoffs to local officials. Her breath caught as she read one email. Ensure the Simmons property is cleared by any means necessary. I don't care about delays or complaints. Tears blurred her vision, but she quickly stuffed the papers back into the envelope. This was it, proof that Victor was behind the devastation her family had endured. As she turned to leave, a shadow loomed in the doorway. Well, Victor's voice drawled, laced with menace. Caught red-handed, Claire froze, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. She met his gaze, her fear giving way to defiance. You can't stop me, she said, her voice steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. Not this time. Victor's smirk widened. We'll see about that. Claire's heart was racing as she sat across from Dorian in his office. The air between them was tense but determined. After their last confrontation, Dorian had finally reviewed the evidence Claire had collected. The proof against Victor was undeniable. Dorian leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. These documents are damning, he admitted, tapping his fingers against the edge of his desk, but we'll need more to bring Victor down completely. He's too well connected for this to be enough. Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. We don't have a choice. If we let him get away with this, he'll destroy more lives, just like he did mine. Dorian's gaze softened briefly, guilt flickering across his face. I won't let that happen, he said firmly. Not again. They spent the next few hours devising a plan. Claire would gather additional evidence, focusing on Victor's communications and any transactions that could tie him to the corruption. Dorian would use his position to access files and contacts that were out of her reach. As they worked, a fragile partnership began to form. The tension that had once defined their interactions was now tempered by a shared purpose. By the following evening, Claire was combing through company records in a secure folder Dorian had provided access to. The information was overwhelming, but she was relentless, determined to find the missing pieces. Meanwhile, Dorian met discreetly with a trusted board member, someone who had expressed concerns about Victor in the past. He was careful not to reveal too much, knowing the walls had ears, but he planted the seeds of doubt. Their progress was slow but steady, until the phone call came. Claire was in the library when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was an unknown number, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. Hello, she answered cautiously. A familiar, smooth voice greeted her. Miss Simmons, I believe we have some unfinished business. Her blood ran cold. Victor, she said, gripping the phone tightly. Very good, he replied, his tone dripping with smugness. You've been quite the busy bee. haven't you? Digging into things that don't concern you. Claire's voice trembled with anger. They concern me when they destroy lives. Victor chuckled darkly. Ah, but you see, Claire, I can destroy lives too. And I suggest you keep that in mind. Before she could respond, he continued, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. Your little brother, Tommy, isn't he? Such a sweet boy. It would be a shame if something unfortunate happened to him. Claire's breath caught, her vision swimming with panic. Don't you dare go near him. Victor's voice was calm, almost casual. That depends entirely on you. Back off, or you won't like what happens next. The line went dead, leaving Claire clutching the phone, her hands trembling. Dorian found her moments later, pacing the room with a wild look in her eyes. Claire, he said, his voice filled with concern. She whirled to face him, her fear and fury spilling over. Victor just called. He threatened Tommy. He knows about my family. Dorian's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. I'll handle this, he said firmly. You don't understand, Claire snapped. He's dangerous. He's not just going to sit back and let us expose him. He'll come after everyone I care about. Dorian stepped closer, his voice steady. Then we make sure he doesn't have the chance. I'll have my security team watch your family. He won't get near them. Her eyes filled with tears of frustration and fear. And what if that's not enough? What if he... Dorian placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. Claire, listen to me. I won't let anything happen to Tommy or to you. But we have to be smart about this. If we let him scare us, he's already won. She took a shaky breath, nodding reluctantly. Okay, what's the plan? They worked through the night, coordinating with Dorian's security team to place guards near Claire's family while continuing to gather evidence. Claire's anxiety was a constant undercurrent, but she channeled it into her work, refusing to let Victor's threat break her resolve. By dawn, they had uncovered another critical piece of information, a series of offshore accounts tied to Victor. The accounts showed suspicious transfers linked to the redevelopment projects, further solidifying the case against him. Dorian leaned back in his chair, exhaustion evident on his face. This might be enough to take to the board, he said. But we need to move fast before Victor realizes we're closing in. Claire nodded, her own exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Let's do it. As the day wore on, the weight of Victor's threat lingered in the back of Claire's mind. But with each piece of evidence they uncovered, her determination grew. She wouldn't let him win, not after everything he had taken from her. When Dorian caught her staring out the window, lost in thought, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're going to stop him, Claire, he said quietly. And when we do, he won't be able to hurt anyone else. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe him. The boardroom was a fortress of polished wood and glass, its walls adorned with the legacy of Westwood Industries. A long table stretched down the center, where members of the board sat in tense silence. Dorian stood at the head of the room, his posture unyielding as he addressed the most critical meeting of his career. Claire stood by the door, her hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't supposed to be here. This was a battle Dorian insisted he fight himself, but she had refused to stay away. She had been a part of this fight from the start, and she wasn't about to back down now. Victor sat near the middle of the table, a picture of feigned calm. His sharp suit and confident smirk belied the storm that was about to hit. Dorian's voice cut through the room. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Today's agenda is simple: transparency. Recent events have brought to light troubling practices tied to Westwood Industries redevelopment projects. Practices that jeopardized lives. Murmurs rippled through the room, but Victor raised a hand, his tone oozing with mock concern. Dorian, we all want transparency, but making baseless accusations in front of the board is hardly productive. Dorian's steely gaze locked onto Victor. These aren't baseless accusations. They're supported by evidence. He gestured toward Claire, who stepped forward with a flash drive in hand. Claire hesitated for only a moment before inserting the drive into the room's presentation system. Screens around the table lit up, displaying the damning documents she and Dorian had uncovered. This, Dorian continued, gesturing to the evidence on the screen, is a detailed account of financial misconduct, unauthorized decisions, and unethical practices tied directly to Victor Langston. These actions were not only immoral, they were criminal. The room erupted into a cacophony of voices. Victor's composure cracked as he leaned forward, his voice raised in defense. This is absurd. These documents could have been fabricated by anyone. Are we really going to take the word of an outsider? His gaze turned to Claire, venomous and sharp. A woman with no ties to this company, no credibility? Claire's heart raced, but she refused to let fear silence her. She stepped closer to the table, her voice clear and unwavering. I may not have a title or a fortune, but I know what it's like to lose everything because of greed. The evidence doesn't lie, and neither do I. Victor Langston put lives at risk for profit. If you ignore this, you're complicit. Her words hung in the air, silencing the room. Dorian turned back to the board, his voice firm. The evidence is real. The damage Victor has caused is real. If we let this continue, it will destroy everything this company stands for. Victor's smirk returned, his tone dripping with mockery. And what about you, Dorian? Are we supposed to believe you're innocent in all this? Your name is on those approvals. You signed off on every project I handled. If I go down, you're coming with me. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Victor's words had struck a nerve, and Claire saw doubt flicker in their eyes. Dorian took a deep breath, his expression unflinching. He's right, he admitted. I signed off on those projects. I trusted people like Victor to act in the company's best interest, and that trust was misplaced. But I'm not hiding from my responsibility. He turned to the board, his tone resolute. I'm proposing a plan to make things right. Effective immediately, I will sell a significant portion of the company's assets to fund the rebuilding of the neighborhoods affected by these projects. This company will stand for integrity, not greed. The room fell silent. The board members stared at Dorian, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. Victor, however, looked livid. You're willing to burn down your own company to cover your mistakes? Victor sneered. Dorian's gaze didn't waver. I'm willing to do what's necessary to restore what we've taken. Claire stepped forward again, her voice steady. Dorian isn't burning down anything. He's rebuilding. And for the first time, this company will stand for something real. The silence stretched until one of the senior board members spoke. I agree with Dorian. This company's future depends on its integrity. Victor Langston, you're relieved of your duties effective immediately. Victor shot to his feet, his face contorted with rage. You'll regret this, all of you, he spat, before storming out of the room. As the door slammed shut behind him, the tension in the room began to ease. Dorian looked at Claire, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Thank you, he said quietly. She nodded, her chest swelling with a mix of relief and exhaustion. We're not done yet, she replied. But it's a start. That evening, Dorian gathered the board members and staff in a public announcement. He outlined the company's new direction, pledging transparency and integrity moving forward. He also shared his commitment to rebuilding the neighborhoods devastated by past projects, including Claire's. The announcement was met with mixed reactions, but Claire stood by his side, her presence a testament to his sincerity. After the meeting, as they walked through the garden, Dorian turned to Claire. I know this doesn't erase what happened, he said softly, but I meant what I said. I'll do everything I can to make it right. Claire stopped, meeting his gaze. Actions speak louder than words, Dorian. But today, you showed me that you're willing to fight for what's right. That matters. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that change was possible, not just for Dorian, but for herself as well. The car came to a stop at the edge of the block where Claire's old neighborhood had once stood. Dorian stepped out first, his gaze scanning the surroundings as though he was trying to absorb every detail. Claire followed, her footsteps slower, more hesitant. The streets were quieter than she remembered, the air tinged with nostalgia and the faint scent of fresh-cut grass. It had been years since she'd last walked these sidewalks, but the memories were still vivid. Kids playing in the street, neighbors chatting on porches, the sound of her brother's laughter. Now, much of the area bore the scars of what had happened. Empty lots dotted the block where homes used to stand, and others were abandoned, their walls charred and crumbling. Claire exhaled deeply, her chest tightening. "It used to be so alive," she said quietly. Dorian glanced at her, his face etched with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment. "I didn't realize how much was lost here." "You wouldn't," she replied, her tone sharper than she intended. She immediately regretted it, but Dorian didn't flinch. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said softly. "I'm here to listen, and to do better." His sincerity caught her off guard, and for a moment, she simply stared at him. Finally, she nodded, gesturing for him to follow as she began walking down the street. As they moved deeper into the neighborhood, a few familiar faces began to emerge. An elderly woman sitting on her porch squinted at Claire, then her face lit up. "Claire Simmons? Is that you?" Claire smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "Mrs. Turner, it's been so long." The woman hobbled over, taking Claire's hands in hers. "I thought we'd never see you again. This place hasn't been the same since the fire." Her eyes flicked to Dorian, and her smile faltered. "And who's this?" Claire hesitated. "This is Dorian. He's helping me." Dorian extended a hand, his expression respectful. "It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am." Mrs. Turner looked at him for a long moment before shaking his hand. "Well, if he's with you, I suppose that's good enough for me." They spent the afternoon reconnecting with people who had stayed, listening to their stories of resilience and loss. Claire felt a mix of emotions, sadness for what was gone, but also hope as she saw the strength of her community. At one point, she noticed Dorian speaking quietly with a group of residents, his usual composed demeanor softened. He listened intently, nodding as they spoke about their struggles and what they needed to rebuild. Later, as they walked back toward the car, Claire turned to him. "You didn't have to come here," she said. "Yes, I did," he replied, meeting her gaze. "I needed to see it for myself, to understand what you've been fighting for." She studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. "And what do you think now?" "I think I've spent too much of my life looking at numbers and not enough at people," he admitted. "But I'm ready to change that. If this community will let me, I want to help rebuild. Not just the homes, but the trust that was lost." Claire felt her defenses begin to crack. For so long, she had carried the weight of anger and mistrust. But in that moment, she saw a man who was trying to make amends, not for his own benefit, but because it was the right thing to do. "I believe you," she said softly. Dorian's expression shifted, relief washing over him. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they stood in silence for a moment, watching the light fade. "Thank you for coming today," Claire said. It means a lot to me." "I should be thanking you," he replied. "You've shown me a side of life I've been blind to for far too long." She turned to him, her heart pounding. "Dorian, I don't know where this leaves us, but I do know one thing. I'm starting to see you differently, and it scares me." He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "I'm not asking you to decide anything now, but I want you to know I care about you, Claire, more than I ever thought I could." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, the weight of their shared history disappeared, leaving only the connection between them. She nodded, a small smile breaking through. "Maybe we can figure it out together." Dorian smiled back, the tension in his posture finally easing. "I'd like that." As they walked back to the car, side by side, Claire felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. The sunlight streamed through the windows of Claire's modest kitchen, casting a warm glow over the room. For the first time in years, the atmosphere felt light. Her grandmother sat at the table, sipping tea, her cheeks rosy with health. Tommy was at the counter, hunched over a science kit Claire had bought him, his excitement filling the room as he carefully pieced together a small circuit. Claire leaned against the counter, watching her family with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The financial strain that had once weighed so heavily on them was gone, replaced by stability. Thanks to Dorian's intervention, her grandmother was receiving top-notch medical care, and Tommy's tuition for a prestigious STEM program had been fully covered. You seem lost in thought, Eleanor said, her voice soft but knowing. Claire smiled, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Just grateful. It's been a long time since things felt normal. Eleanor reached out to touch Claire's hand. Normal isn't always what we think it is. Sometimes, it's better than what we imagined. Claire glanced at her reflection in the window. Her scar, once a source of shame, caught the light. She didn't flinch anymore when she saw it. Instead, it reminded her of everything she had survived, everything she had overcome. Meanwhile, across town, Dorian sat in the conference room of a small but bustling nonprofit office. Gone were the sleek, impersonal corporate boardrooms of Westwood Industries. This space was filled with vibrant energy, whiteboards covered in ideas, bulletin boards pinned with photos of rebuilt communities, and a team of passionate individuals working tirelessly to bring his vision to life. Dorian leaned forward, reviewing the latest progress report with his newly hired team. "We're on track to complete the first set of homes by the end of the year," the project lead said, her voice filled with pride. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Good. Let's prioritize the families who've been waiting the longest." This wasn't about damage control or public relations. It was about doing the right thing. For years, he had hidden behind the shield of his wealth, using it as a buffer against the world. Now, he was using it to build something meaningful. That evening, Dorian arrived at Claire's apartment, carrying a bag of groceries and a bouquet of wildflowers. Claire opened the door, her expression softening at the sight of him. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I wanted to," he replied simply. They moved to the kitchen, where he began unpacking the groceries. As they worked side by side, the conversation flowed easily, a stark contrast to the guarded exchanges of their early days. After dinner, they stepped out onto the small balcony, the city lights twinkling below. Claire leaned against the railing, her arms crossed as the cool breeze brushed her face. "Things feel different now," she said, her voice contemplative. Dorian joined her, his hands resting on the railing. "They are different, and it's because of you." She glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "Me? You showed me what it means to care about something bigger than myself," he said. "To face things I'd rather ignore, even when it's uncomfortable. You made me want to be better." Claire's heart swelled at his words, and for a moment, she was silent. Then she turned to him fully, her voice steady. "You've changed too, Dorian. You've shown me that scars, whether they're on the outside or the inside, don't define us. They shape us, but they don't have to limit us." His gaze softened, and he reached out to take her hand. "I'm glad you see it that way, because I see your scars as a reminder of how strong you are." Claire smiled, her eyes glistening. "And I see yours as proof that even when we fall, we can get back up again." They stood there for a while, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. As the night deepened, Claire felt a sense of closure settling over her. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, something that gave her strength instead of weighing her down. For the first time, she saw a future not defined by loss, but by hope. And standing beside her was the man who had once been her adversary, but was now her partner, her equal, and perhaps something more. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the newly rebuilt neighborhood. Families gathered in small clusters, laughter and conversation filling the air as children ran along freshly paved sidewalks. For the first time in years, the area was alive again, a testament to resilience and hope. Claire stood near the entrance to a small community center, her eyes scanning the crowd. The center, along with several homes, was part of the first wave of Dorian's rebuilding efforts. The modest structure wasn't grand, but it was vibrant, painted in warm colors with a mural designed by local artists adorning one wall. "Look at this place," Claire's grandmother said from her wheelchair, her voice filled with emotion. "It's like it's come back to life." Claire smiled, her heart swelling. "It has." Nearby, Tommy was chatting excitedly with a group of kids about his STEM program, already talking about how he wanted to design buildings that could withstand anything. Claire felt a pang of pride as she watched him thrive in a way she hadn't seen in years. "Your brother seems happy," came a familiar voice from behind her. She turned to find Dorian standing there, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. He was dressed casually, a rare sight, but the way he carried himself still radiated quiet confidence. "He's getting there," Claire said, smiling. "We all are." Dorian gestured toward the gathering crowd. "It's a good start, but there's still a lot of work to be done." Claire nodded, her gaze following his. "What you've done here, it's more than I ever thought possible." "Thank you." He met her eyes, his voice steady. "I didn't do this alone. You're the reason I started this, Claire. You made me see what I'd been blind to for so long." Her cheeks warmed at his words, but before she could respond, a small group approached, interrupting the moment. "Mr. Westwood, Miss Simmons," one of the residents said, smiling broadly. "We just wanted to say thank you. This means more to us than you'll ever know." Dorian shook their hands, his usual reserved demeanor giving way to genuine warmth. "It's the least we could do," he said. As the evening wore on, the gathering transitioned into a celebration. Strings of lights illuminated the space, and the sound of music and laughter echoed through the streets. Claire and Dorian moved among the crowd, sharing conversations and smiles with the people they had worked so hard to help. At one point, Dorian found himself beside Claire again, both of them leaning against the railing of the community center's porch, watching the festivities. "You know," Claire began, her voice thoughtful, "when I first met you, I never would have imagined we'd end up here." Dorian chuckled softly. "Neither did I. Back then, I thought I had everything figured out. Turns out, I had a lot to learn." She glanced at him, her eyes shining in the soft light. "We both did." He turned to face her, his expression earnest. "Claire, I know I've made mistakes. Big ones. But standing here, seeing what we've done together, I finally feel like I'm doing something that matters." "You are," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And you don't have to do it alone anymore." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Dorian reached out, taking her hand in his. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly, his voice tinged with vulnerability. Claire shook her head, squeezing his hand. "It's not about deserving. It's about what we do next. Together." A soft smile spread across his face, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. As the night drew to a close, Claire stood beside Dorian, watching the neighborhood bask in the glow of a new beginning. Families were heading home, their laughter lingering in the air, and the lights from the community center shone like a beacon of hope. "I think we're going to be okay," Claire said softly. Dorian glanced at her, his hand still holding hers. "I know we will." For the first time, Claire let herself believe it. They had come so far, through pain, loss, and uncertainty, and now they stood on the edge of something new, something worth fighting for. As the last of the guests departed and the quiet of the evening settled in, Claire leaned into Dorian's side, and together, they looked toward the horizon, where the promise of a brighter future awaited.